Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of EDU 600. We are now in module, or actually on Monday we're in module 5, which is also week number 5. And I wanted to just congratulate everybody for sticking with all the materials. We are just finishing week number 4, or module 4, and we had 2 assignments there. And I appreciate all of the effort that has gone into it. If you have not submitted your assignments, please don't worry about it. You still have time. First one is the qualitative critique. Second one is the visual displays of data. If you have any questions on those, please let me know. The next few weeks have we continue on with that intensity of week number 4 into module number 5. And in module number 5, as with last week, this week we have part 1 and part 2. So I encourage you to take a look at both of those, and I would start with part 1, module 5, part 1, and then go to part 2. So as I'm just going to give you a preview of the materials that we have this week, but to set the stage, what we're going to be looking at this week in the text, the materials that I'm providing this week, is on experimental research. Now, for many of those, especially those in the educational world, this may be a typical type of research that you're familiar with. You might use it in your school. If this is research that's oftentimes used in medical research. There's a lot of studies with COVID-19 and the efficacy of the vaccines. They use experimental research. So part 1 focuses in on experimental research. What I'll do is I'll go through the materials for part number 1, and then I will switch gears and go to part number 2. Now, there's a reason I haven't combined all of these into module 5 and just have one part. There's a lot of materials here, and I wanted you to just kind of take the first step in a chunk, and then the second step, part 2, in another chunk, because taken together there's a lot of materials, and I didn't want to contribute to you becoming overwhelmed with the materials. So let's get right to the materials, and as you can see from what I have up on the screen, we are in Module 5, Part 1. I can't tell you even why I put one of my favorite Tolkien quotes, and this is from The Lord of the Rings, and you can read it as easily as I can say it to you, but it's one of my favorite sayings, and basically I got today, and that's all I can take care of, and I might not get tomorrow, so whatever time I have, I'm going to take advantage of it. So don't worry, it doesn't relate to this course, but maybe it does. Maybe you feel like you have to take this course one day at a time, and if so, I hope you enjoy that saying. Okay, let's move right on to it. So as you can see, the video that I'm recording right now goes here. So this week, we are going to be really focusing in on experimental research. This is, as I say right here, this type of research adheres to scientific research design, meaning you have a hypothesis and you're really manipulating variables. What's the purpose? Well, you're really looking for the relationship between the two variables, dependent variable and the independent variable. Chapter 9, we get into a version which is really kind of a true form of an experiment, and I'll get into that a little bit in the future. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at the video. These are by Jeff Beaudry, the typical bell curve. Excellent work on that. Have a video on experimental research. It's only 6 minutes, but it explains experimental research extremely well. Types of experimental designs. Now, all of this is meant to augment what is in the textbook. So I certainly encourage you and expect that you will use the textbook and read chapters 8 and 9. So this is something I'm not going to collect, but identify 2 to 3 quotes or concepts from each chapter that help you understand the concepts of experimental research. So you can write them out, put them away. I may come back to those a little later in the course, but think of this as something that you don't have to submit to me in any way. It's really for your own use. I do have an introduction. This is a separate paper. It's only 3 pages. Goes into the kind of what is the purpose of experimental research. If you have time, I suggest you take a look at it. And then what I'd like you to do, you could do it in either this part or the next part, because it ties in with the experimental critique that is due on June 20th. So here's the article. Give your ideas some legs. Basically, it's looking at the relationship, the positive effect of walking and creativity. I'll get into more information on that in part 2. So that is what we have in part 1. I mean, there's a lot of reading and a lot of looking at videos. One thing that I did want to point out, this introduction to the research, take a look at that. It's only 3 pages. It just gives you an idea of what's involved. I'm switching gears. Also putting in, here's just to kind of walk you through experimental research. I'm adding this to the mix of things. I'll put this right below. I'll put this in part 1. But this is a pretty simple experiment as you can see, an experimental study of the effectiveness of multimedia in college English teaching. So the abstract talks about what it is doing and how it is doing. The introduction. So really what they're looking for is they're splitting a class, they're putting half of the class in, they have the same teacher, but in one of the classes they're going to use many other teaching methods at their disposal. They're using multimedia, and really they're trying to see, is one more effective than the other? So traditional lectures versus traditional lectures plus other stuff. So you could almost say the materials I use on a weekly basis is a good example of multimedia, in that you're getting different materials presented in different ways. Okay, so the methods. So basically they split the groups. You can read about that. They split the group into 2 parts. So that's really the experiment. The experiment is they split the group. They're going to have one group getting traditional lectures. That's it. And then the other group's getting traditional lectures, plus they're getting multimedia. And then really what they're saying is one more effective? So then what you do, you can take a look at the instruments that they use, the test, the methods. So the data analysis, how did they prepare the data? And I think a big thing, one thing about experimental research is you are looking at the numbers. This is true quantitative research. So in the quantitative study, really they're looking for data so they can run statistical analysis on. Coming down, the discussion, they fed the results into a statistical processing software called SPSS. I actually use this in my doctoral dissertation. So basically it throws out a lot of the materials. Now, there's a part in here, there's more information I have, and I have videos in part 2 on the statistical testing. You can also look at last week. But you hear me talk a lot about the p-value. And in here, the reason I'm adding this to the equation so you can take a look at it is it's pretty simple. But what they are saying is that the p-value of 0.05 has no significance at all. So basically, you know, they do sum it up by saying it did show some advantage over traditional methods, but not really a lot. So that's that. Like I said, this is a pretty simplistic example of experimental research. Further discussion, what it means, and then the conclusion. So this is, once again, an example of experimental research. Two groups of people, same class, they're going to split them. They use teaching methods, traditional teaching methods on one. They use traditional teaching methods on the second one, plus they add multimedia. So if you want, you can take a look at this. All of experimental research, it's well covered in our textbooks, but if you're looking for something a little bit different, that might take it a step further and might help you read the article that you are going to be using for the experimental critique assignment, come back to this one. And/or at any time, we can set up a Zoom. You can contact me. We can talk through email or on the phone. So that is what this article is. I will put that right in part number 1. Okay, I'm going to stop this. Okay, as you can see, we are now in part 2 of Module 5, where we're going to be taking a look at factorial designs and single subject research. And for those, I know we have people in the class that are somewhat familiar with actually both of these type of research, specifically the single subject research. So once again, this is the video that's included in part 1. So what we're doing, we're really just continuing our exploration of quantitative research, and specifically factorial designs and complex experimental designs. So these are Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. So factorial designs investigates the influence of 2 or more treatments and/or levels of treatments. And single subject, which for those that may be in the field of special ed or counseling, you're familiar with this. So it's also, single subject research is also known as case experiments, single case experiments. So take a look at that. There's some information on here specifically on single subject. So what are we doing in this part? Well, we have Chapter 9 and 10. We have videos. And then I'll explain what the assignment due on June 20th is. So keep on, right here there's a guidelines to reviewing qualitative research, APA formatting when you write the final, or when you write the assignment. So this whole section is on the assignment that you have coming up. This is very similar to what you just completed with the qualitative critique. You may see a slight variation of the titles that we're using. And so the first thing you need to do is actually read the research. So the research I presented, it's about dogs and the effect of, I'll come back down to that in 1 second. So here's information on the assignment. And then I have a whole bunch of videos in here that just explain some of the statistical analysis, the variables, independent versus dependent variable, what is hypothesis testing. We have complex experiments. So this is kind of the latter, this is the latter portion. Once again, experiments where you're using more treatments. And then I just mentioned something, I know I've received a couple of emails from folks, and, this is still a hard time. We are still in COVID. Things are getting better, but if you're having any trouble, please reach out to me. I would be happy to help. We can work something out. My goal is for everybody to succeed in this class, and I will do anything possible to help you achieve that. Okay, so let's go back here. So here's the assignment. Just like the first one, please write 1,000 to 1,200 word critique. You're going to be reading, I'm going to click on this because it gives us a little more detail. Okay, so here's the information, specific information on the assignment that's due on the 20th. So I'd like you to read the article on dogs. I'd like you, just so you know what's down here, we have an exemplar, the critique guide, and for those that didn't know where it was the last time, we have the article critique rubrics here. So possible 20 points. The format is the same. Really, it's the same paper, it's just on a different kind of research. One thing I would like to talk about is, so here is the research that you're reading. Give your ideas some legs, the positive effect of walking on creative thinking. So in here, there are 4 experiments. When you read this, I'd like you to read the entire paper. I'd like you to focus in on experiment 1 or 2. Maybe read those with a little more detail. Now, I'd like you to write your critique on one of the experiments. Basically, if you wrote your critique on every 4 experiment, you would be writing 2, or you would be writing 4 critique papers. So I'd like you to either pick 1 or 2, or you could pick 1 and 2. But it just, you know, the more you add, it's going to complicate your paper, and it will make your paper harder to fit into the 1,000 to 1,200 words. So once again, the way this is set up, the author, and the reason I picked this was the author starts out with experiment number 1, and then he talks about experiment 1, as you can see here, starts here and then comes down here. And he starts the same way. It starts the reason behind it, the methods, the results, keep on going, the discussion, and in the results are statistical information. And that is it. That's number 1. Now, if you wanted to do 1 and 2, talk about both of them in the experiment, or in your critique, that's fine, you can do that, but you do not have to. I'd say just focus in on experiment number 1 or number 2. But if you're reading through it, I'm going to give you, the leeway. If you're reading through it and you say, I really want to talk about number 3 or number 4 because that's more applicable to my work, have at it. I'm just trying to help you so you don't have to write a critique on 4 different experiments that are part of this research study. So if you have any question on this, if I'm overly confused or I'm confusing, let me know. I'd be happy to clarify that for you. So that is it for this week. I'm going to go back to the assignment. Here we are in the assignment. You've attached these. You've submitted them before. That is it. This week, there are no discussion forums. The only thing you have to do by midnight of next Sunday is this experimental research critique. And once we get through this, we really only have 2 more weeks to go, and then we're into the writing of the final paper. So stick with it, folks. Everybody's doing a great job, and I commend you on all of the hard work you're doing. This is not an easy class, and to take it in a pretty advanced, pretty intensive format is not the easiest thing in the world. So let me know if you have questions. I'm sorry I went so long, but there's a lot of materials, and I wanted to make sure that I covered them all. Let me know if I can help, and see you online.